I kept my mouth shut the entire time my son's new wife stood in my garage, looking at my 12-year-old pickup truck with barely concealed pity. She smiled at me the way you smile at a dog that doesn't know any better. My son stood beside her, his hand on the small of her back, and he had the same nervous look he'd been wearing since the rehearsal dinner the night before. I recognized that look. It was the look of a man who had already been briefed. "It's so sweet that you keep it," she said about the truck. "Very authentic." My son's name is Michael. His wife's name is Lauren. They had been married for approximately 19 hours at that point, and she had already started cataloging everything I owned. I am 64 years old. My name is Frank. I have worked with my hands since I was 15 years old, first in my father's shop, then in the Army, then for 12 years hauling freight across 4 states before I scraped together enough to buy my own rig. That was 1,987. By 1994, I had 3 trucks. By 2003, I had 11. A small dispatch office in Harrisburg, and a reputation in the Mid-Atlantic corridor that meant the phone never stopped ringing. My wife Carol built the business alongside me. She handled the books, the contracts, the insurance, the compliance filings. I handled the drivers, the routes, the maintenance, the clients. We were a team in the truest sense of that word. And when she died of a stroke 7 years ago, I sat in our office for 3 days and could not move. I did not tell Lauren any of this when I met her. She asked me what I did for work, and I told her I used to be in trucking and that I was mostly retired now. Both of those things were technically true. I had stepped back from daily operations. I had a manager named Dale, who ran things beautifully. I went in 2 or 3 times a week, checked the numbers, signed what needed signing, and drove home in my 12-year-old pickup truck. Lauren heard retired trucker and nodded pleasantly and moved on to other topics. That was 6 months before the wedding. I noticed things, though. Quietly. The way I had always operated. Watching. Listening. Filing things away without reacting. Michael brought her to Sunday dinner 3 weeks after they started dating, and she spent the first hour asking questions that felt more like an audit than a conversation. How long had I lived in the house? Did I own or rent? Had I thought about downsizing? Wasn't it a lot of space for one person? What did my pension look like? I answered simply, I own the house. I like the space. I manage fine. She smiled and said it must be hard. All alone in such a big place. I said I kept busy. Michael looked relieved that we were getting along. The engagement happened 4 months later. I told my son I was happy for him and that I hoped he was certain. He said he had never been more certain of anything. I believed him. I also believed that Lauren had spent those 4 months gathering information and reaching conclusions, because when Michael brought her to the house to show her the engagement ring his grandmother had left behind, I watched her eyes move around the room the way a contractor's eyes move around a room. Measuring, estimating, calculating. I said nothing. After they left, I called my attorney. His name is Bernard, and he had been handling my business affairs for over 20 years. I told him I wanted to review the structure of the company. He asked if something had happened. I said not yet. He laughed, because he knew me well enough to know that not yet was its own kind of answer. We spent 3 weeks reviewing everything. The company Hartwell Freight, named after the county where Carol and I started, it was already organized as an LLC. That had been in place for years. But I wanted to tighten things further. Bernard walked me through the options. We updated the operating agreement. We clarified succession terms. We moved certain assets into a family trust that I had established years earlier but never fully funded. Carol had always said we should do it. I had put it off. I stopped putting it off. When I was done, I had a structure that was airtight and completely invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. Then I went to the wedding and watched Lauren slide a ring onto my son's finger, and I kept my mouth shut. The first few months were manageable. They bought a house about 40 minutes from mine, a nice colonial in a development that was a little above their combined income, but not obviously so. Michael was an engineer at a regional firm. Lauren worked in marketing for a healthcare company. They were comfortable. They were not wealthy. I know this because Michael, to his credit, has never been good at hiding financial stress. and I could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes when certain topics came up at dinner. Lauren brought up selling my house for the first time in October. She framed it as concern. "The stairs," she said. "The maintenance. The yard. Wasn't it a lot to manage at my age?" I told her I enjoyed the yard, that I had a man who helped with the heavy work, that the stairs kept me sharp. She smiled and said she just worried. That was all. In November, she asked about my finances more directly. We were at their house for Thanksgiving, and after dinner, while Michael was watching football and her parents had stepped outside, she asked me whether I had a financial planner, whether my retirement was structured properly, whether I had considered what would happen to my assets if something happened to me. I told her I had a good attorney and that things were organized. She asked who the attorney was. I said his name was Bernard and that I had worked with him for a long time. She nodded and said that was smart, that you really needed someone you trusted. I agreed. She asked, very casually, whether I had ever thought about bringing Michael more formally into whatever I had going on. "Not for the money," she said quickly, "just for peace of mind, so he would know what to do if something happened to me." She said it would help them both sleep better. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said that was very thoughtful and that I would keep it in mind. Michael came back in from the living room and asked if anyone wanted pie. I said I would love some pie. By January, the dynamic had shifted. Lauren had apparently done some research. I do not know exactly what she found, because I had been careful, but I suspect she found some record of Hartwell Freight, some business filing, some trace of a company that did not match her image of a retired trucker living on pension and savings. She started asking different questions, more specific ones. How many employees did the company have? What kind of contracts? Was it still operating, or mostly wound down? I told her Dale ran the day-to-day now, that it was a smaller operation than it used to be, that I checked in occasionally. She asked what smaller meant. I said smaller than it once was. She did not push further that night, but I could see her recalibrating. The next Sunday, Michael called and asked if he could come over to talk. "Just him," he said. Lauren had a bridal shower to attend for a friend. He sat at my kitchen table with his coffee, and for a few minutes he didn't say anything. I waited. I have always been good at waiting. Finally, he said, "Dad, Lauren thinks we should know more about your finances. Not because we want anything, just so we can help, if you ever need it." I looked at my son. He is 37 years old and has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, though he has never fully accepted that second part. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like a man delivering a message he had not entirely signed off on. I said, "Do you think I need help managing my finances, Michael?" He said, No, I don't." I said, "Then what is this actually about?" He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Lauren felt like I was keeping things from them, that families shouldn't have secrets, that it would just be easier if everyone knew where things stood. I asked him where things stood with his finances. He didn't answer. I said, I was not trying to be difficult. I said I had an attorney, and that everything was organized, and that if something happened to me, he would be taken care of. And that was all he needed to know. I said I had spent 30 years building something and that I intended to protect it, and that protecting it was not the same as hiding it. He nodded. He looked relieved, actually, like he had said what he came to say and my answer had given him something to bring back. I told him to finish his coffee. He stayed for 2 hours. We talked about his job, about a fishing trip we kept meaning to take, about a noise his car was making that I could probably fix in an afternoon. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual. Lauren escalated in March. She called me directly, which she had never done before. She said she had been thinking, and she wanted to be honest with me, woman to man, because she respected me too much to dance around things. She said she had done some research into Hartwell Freight. She said she knew it was more than a small operation. She said she thought it was important that Michael have a real role in the company, not as an employee, but as a partner, so that when the time came, there would be no complications. I listened to her entire speech. Then I said, Lauren, I appreciate you being direct. Let me be direct back. Hartwell Freight is my company. I built it with my wife. The decisions about what happens to it are mine to make. I've made them. Michael will be taken care of. That's all I have to say about it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood, but that she wanted Michael to have what was rightfully his. I said Michael would have what I decided was appropriate. She said she thought that was a little controlling. I said I thought this phone call was a little inappropriate. She said she had hoped we could have a real conversation. I said we had just had one. I hung up and called Bernard. She sent a consultant to my office in April. I want to say that again because it still astonishes me. She sent a man, a business consultant, she said. Someone who helped families with succession planning to my office in Harrisburg without asking me. Dale called me and said there was a gentleman in the waiting room claiming to be there to discuss the Hartwell family transition plan. Dale said the man had a briefcase and a lot of confidence. I told Dale to offer him coffee and tell him I'd be there in 45 minutes. I took 90. The consultant's name was Gregory, and he was about 35 with a firm handshake and the smooth manner of someone who had been trained to disarm suspicious older men. He said Lauren had engaged him to help facilitate a conversation about the company's future. He said it was completely informal. He said his role was purely advisory. I let him talk for about 10 minutes. Then I said, "Gregory." He said Lauren had retained him. I said, "Lauren is my son's wife. She has no legal relationship to this company. She has no role in this company. She was not authorized to send you here. I don't know what she told you. But whatever arrangement you think you have with her has nothing to do with me or Hartwell Freight." He shifted in his chair. I said, "I'd like you to leave now." He left his card on the table. I left it there. I called Michael that evening and I told him, calmly and without anger, exactly what had happened. I told him his wife had sent a consultant to my business office without my knowledge or consent. I told him I had asked the man to leave. I told him I was not going to discuss this again, but that I wanted him to know because he deserved to know. There was a very long silence on the phone. Michael said he didn't know anything about it. I believed him. That was almost worse. He said he was sorry. He said he would talk to Lauren. I said I hoped so. The next 3 weeks were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Lauren did not call. Michael called twice. Brief and slightly strained conversations about nothing in particular. I went to the office. I drove my truck. I planted the garden. Carol had always kept going on the south side of the house. I waited. The call came on a Tuesday. Michael asked if he and Lauren could come over Saturday morning. He said they wanted to talk. He said it was important. His voice had a careful quality that I recognized, not his own voice, exactly, but the voice of someone who had rehearsed. I said Saturday was fine. I said come for breakfast. I called Bernard Thursday and told him what I thought was coming. He said he would be available by phone if I needed him. I said, I didn't think I would. Friday night I sat on the back porch where Carol and I had spent 1,000 evenings, and I thought about the first truck we bought together, a 1987 Kenworth, used, with a transmission that needed work and a sleeping cab that smelled like cigarettes. We drove it together from the lot to the yard, and she sat in the passenger seat with a road atlas open across her lap, tracing routes with her finger, calculating fuel costs in her head. She always said the atlas was just for comfort. She had the routes memorized. She knew where everything was. I thought I did too. They arrived at 9:30. Lauren was dressed as if she had a presentation to give. Michael looked like he had not slept well. I had made coffee and eggs. I set the table the way Carol always did, with placemats and real glasses, because I was raised to treat guests properly regardless of the circumstances. We ate. We talked about small things, the weather, their house, a neighbor of mine who had recently retired. Then Lauren put her fork down and said she wanted to talk about the company. I said, all right. She said she and Michael had spent a lot of time thinking about the future, about what was best for everyone, and they had come to the conclusion that Hartwell Freight should be sold. She said the market was good right now for small regional carriers. She said there were buyers who would pay well. She said the money would set Michael up for life and allow me to truly enjoy my retirement without worrying about a company I shouldn't have to manage at my age. She said this as if she had been considering my well-being all along. I looked at my son. He was looking at his coffee cup. I said, "Michael, is this what you want?" He looked up. He said, "I think it makes sense, Dad." Financially, I nodded. I drank my coffee. Then I said, "I'd like to show you something." I went to the desk in my office, the one Carol bought at an estate sale in 2001, and I took out a folder. I brought it back to the kitchen table, and I set it down between us. I said, "This is the operating agreement for Hartwell Freight, LLC. The company is wholly owned by the Hartwell Family Trust. The trust was established in 2009, updated comprehensively last year. I am the sole trustee. The terms of the trust specify that the company cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the approval of the trustee, which is me, and following my death or incapacitation. The trusteeship passes to Michael under conditions that include a 5-year operating covenant, meaning it cannot be sold for 5 years after he takes control." Lauren stared at the folder. I said, "The trust also specifies that no spouse of a beneficiary has any claim to trust assets in the event of a divorce or legal dispute." That was Carol's idea, actually. She was very specific about it. Lauren said, "You can't just that. Seems like it's designed to exclude." I said, "It's designed to protect what Carol and I built. That was always the intention." She said, "Michael has a right to his inheritance." I said, "Michael will inherit control of a company with 11 trucks, 18 full-time drivers, contracts with 4 regional distributors, and revenue that I'm not going to quote to you at my kitchen table. He will inherit it according to the terms Carol and I set when she was alive, and those terms stand." Michael was very still. Lauren said, "This isn't fair. We deserve to know what we're dealing with." I said, "You're not dealing with anything, Lauren. This is my company. My family built it. The decisions about its future were made years ago by me and by Carol, and a consultant you sent to my office without my permission, and a Saturday morning conversation at my kitchen table are not going to change those decisions." She started to say something else. I said, "I think we're done with this topic." There was a silence that lasted a long time. Lauren picked up her coffee cup and put it down without drinking. Michael was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Something between shock and something else. Something I thought might be the beginning of clarity. Lauren said she needed some air and walked out to the back porch. Michael and I sat at the table. After a while, he said, "Dad, how long have you been planning this?" I said, "Since before the wedding." He was quiet. I said, "I didn't plan it against you. I planned it for you. There's a difference." He said, "She's going to be angry." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't know she sent that consultant. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you." He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment. It was the same gesture he made as a little boy when something overwhelmed him. Then he straightened up and looked at me and said, "You drive that truck on purpose, don't you? The old one." I said, "It runs fine." He laughed. It was a short laugh, but it was real. I said, "Michael, your mother and I did not spend 30 years building something so that it could be sold off to strangers in a good market. We built it to last. We built it for you, eventually. But for you, not for whoever came into your life and decided they wanted a piece of it. You understand the difference?" He said he understood. I said, "Then make sure you remember it." Lauren came back inside. She was composed in the way of someone who has decided to be gracious in defeat, which is its own kind of performance, but I gave her credit for it. She said she understood she had overstepped. She said she hoped I knew she only wanted what was best for Michael. I said I knew she believed that. She said she hoped we could move past it. I said I was not a man who held grudges. That was true. I had never been interested in prolonged conflict. I was interested in clarity, and now we had it. They left around noon. I watched them drive away from the front window. Then I went out to the garage and worked on the truck for a couple of hours. There was nothing wrong with it, but I wanted to keep my hands busy, and there is something about the logic of an engine that Carol always said I found calming. She was right. She usually was. Michael called me that evening. He said Lauren had cried on the drive home, and that they had talked, really talked. for the first time in a while. He said he had told her some things that were overdue. He said he couldn't promise everything would be perfect, but that he wanted me to know he was grateful, that he was sorry it had gotten to that point, that he wished he had seen things more clearly earlier. I said that was all right, that seeing things clearly was the important part, and that it didn't matter how long it took as long as you got there. He asked if we could do that fishing trip this summer, the one we had been talking about for 2 years. I said I would book the cabin. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Carol and I had done the books every Sunday night, the same table where Michael had done his homework and drawn trucks in the margins of his notebooks and grown up in the general direction of a decent man. The folder was still there. I picked it up and put it back in the desk. Outside, the light was going golden over the yard. The garden was coming in along the south side of the house. The same rows Carol had kept tomatoes, basil, the climbing beans she could never get anyone else excited about. I tended them because she had tended them, and because some things deserved to continue. I had not built Hartwell Freight to be sold in a good market by people who had not built it. I had not driven through ice storms on I-81 at 2 in the morning and negotiated freight rates at dock offices that smelled like diesel and old coffee, and weathered every recession, and watched Carol do the quarterly filings at this very table. I had not done all of that to have it, discussed over Saturday breakfast like a line item on someone else's budget, but none of that needed to be said out loud. It never had. Carol always told me that my quietness made people underestimate me, and that this was a feature, not a flaw. She said the people who talked the most were usually the ones who had worked the least. She was right about that too. I sat there a little longer and then I got up and went out to water the garden while the light lasted.